Vonk or Revolution is the Belgian branch of an international Marxist organization, the International Marxist Tendency. We get together weekly to discuss the organization, to discuss the latest news, to discuss our paper sale, for example, because we have a 2-monthly paper. We are active at the university campus and also in the streets when protests are happening. We also join them and put up a table to sell papers and everything. We want a socialist world's revolution, to have a fairer world, actually. That's kind of it. Joe, are you ready for the interview?
I'm ready.
Okay, awesome. So here goes. I'll start with the first question. In Belgium, some academics have already made a plea not to blame capitalism. They say it's a lamentable but accidental natural disaster. But is it also coincidental? There seem to be good arguments to link the origins of corona and other diseases to ecological destruction and the terrible meat industry.
Okay, well, the crisis that's been unleashed by this coronavirus wasn't caused by the coronavirus. It was prepared in the last period. We've seen over a decade of austerity that's built up a huge amount of resentments and instability in the system. And the coronavirus itself was just the catalyst for a much deeper crisis of capitalism. But even that catalyst, it's true, is not really accidental. It was prepared in the last period. A serious public health disaster of some kind has long been brewing. In 2009, there was a doctor, an Australian doctor, who was working on a cure for SARS-CoV-1, so that's the coronavirus that preceded COVID-19, who warned that because SARS was continuing to jump from animals to humans, another pandemic would occur. And another doctor who was working on the same team said, more recently, we knew the next one was coming, and it was likely to be a coronavirus from a bat. So scientists have long expected not only that you'd have some kind of major pandemic in the next period, but specifically it will be a coronavirus. And they even were pretty confident about the way that it would come about. But really, this is part of a broader issue. In 1994, there was a really excellent book produced, not by a Marxist, but by a journalist called Laurie Garrett, called The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance. And it was followed up by another book called The Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health in 2001. And both of them predicted that the 2000s and the 2010s would see a massive increase in the number of pandemics sweeping the world. And this was all corroborated in 2018, so a year or so before COVID-19, by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which is a body that keeps an eye on infectious diseases and so on, that said that a number of diseases in the last period, like SARS, MERS, Ebola, Zika, yellow fever, were part, and I quote, of a new era of high impact, potentially fast spreading outbreaks that are more frequently detected and increasingly difficult to manage, and that any country without basic primary health care, public services, health infrastructure, and effective infection control mechanisms face the greatest losses, including death, displacement, and economic devastation. So yes, scientists have long expected something like this period where pandemics are more common. And they also have long since warned that the whole world is underprepared, but especially poor countries are severely underprepared for this new period. And this prevalence of pandemics can partly be explained by capitalist destruction of the environment and exploitation of the Earth's resources. Deforestation through logging, urban expansion, road building, mining, and so on destroys wild species habitats and puts them more and more into contact with humans, which offers more opportunities for the microbes that exist harmlessly in their bodies to spill over, is the term, spill over into human beings. For example, the deadly Ebola pandemic of 2017 also originated from species of bats who were forced to roost in trees and farms and people's backyards because all their natural habitat's been destroyed. And these animals become carriers for animal to human strains of viruses due to repeated contact, and pass on these pathogens either through bites, fecal matter, or in the case of COVID-19, through being sold in informal wet markets, which are essential sources of food in poor communities in Asia and Africa. But you have all these species that would never encounter one another naturally crammed together in one place, and it becomes an ideal breeding ground for deadly disease. And this was exactly what resulted in the mutant strain of coronavirus that caused the SARS epidemic, and we're pretty sure it's what caused COVID-19 as well. But that's only one scenario where dangerous diseases can mutate and spread. Bird flu, for instance, began in monoculture. So monocultures are when a farm or a factory farm only has one kind of animal, of chickens, where in these big factory farm operations, you cram hundreds of thousands of poultry together in close proximity, in terrible conditions, and they become breeding grounds for disease. And pathogens that are relatively harmless spread between their bodies very quickly, become more virulent, become more dangerous, and eventually they can mutate into strains that can infect humans. And of course, bird flu can kill people very easily. And swine flu originated from monocultures of pigs. And interestingly, the pork farming industry lobbied the World Health Organization to rename swine flu by its scientific name, H1N1, so that people wouldn't realize where its origin came from. And another long-term threat posed by intensive farming, aside from the development of new diseases, is that it cultivates antibiotic-resistant microbes. And if you've ever worked in a hospital, you'll know that there are lots of infections and diseases that are increasingly difficult to treat because they're becoming resistant to our existing arsenal of antibiotics. And the problem is livestock is really expensive, and it lives longer when it's dosed with antibiotics. But when you dose hundreds of thousands of animals with antibiotics, it puts a global selective pressure on microbes to become resistant to those antibiotics. And that has serious consequences for human health. And all of this, all of these material reasons for why you're seeing more and more of these dangerous diseases, it puts me in mind of a line by Engels, which I included in an article I wrote recently about this question. And it was written in Dialectics of Nature. He says that let us not flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human victories over nature. For each such victory of nature takes its revenge on us. Each victory, it is true, in the first place brings about the results we expected, but in the second and third places it has quite different, unforeseen effects, which too often cancel out the first. And I can't think of a more apt example than what we're currently seeing. Although I want to underline that none of this is to say that we need to do away with less efficient food production, that we need less urbanization or housing or infrastructure at all. I'm not saying we should all return to living in the forests and abandon modern technology and society and production. What I am saying is that the anarchic and rapacious exploitation of the planet's resources by capitalism is having deadly consequences. And there's no reason for any of this. There's no inherent reason that we have to destroy animals' habitats in huge swathes. There's no reason we have to cram monocultures of animals dosed on antibiotics meant for humans cheek by jowl into these nightmarish factories where they become breeding grounds for disease under a rationally planned socialist economy. All of these processes could be made more efficient, more humane, and safer. They wouldn't have to satisfy the capitalist lust for profits, which is the only reason that all these practices currently are as dangerous and bad as they are. You could look after animals' welfare, but you could also, in the long term, protect human welfare by preventing the development and spread of these dangerous diseases like COVID-19.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Then now, not about the origin anymore, but about the situation right now. The way in which governments are dealing with the pandemic is terrible. They are totally incapable of organizing what is needed to get through in the best possible way. In Belgium, there was this whole mask affair spectacle that has been going on for weeks. There are still not sufficient masks for the workers who have to keep on working, let alone the quality of the masks. And also savings in healthcare are being felt more than ever. But also in the field of medicines and vaccines, the situation is poor. There seems to be no progress at all, even though the coronavirus is similar to viruses that were already known, such as SARS. Is there a reason for this?
So before I answer the question, a quick aside on government's responses and the shortages that health personnel are facing. From my own country, in Britain, it's been absolutely dire. I mean, it looks like Britain will have the second highest death rate next to the USA.
Yeah.
And in this country, where our National Health Service has been hit by successive cuts for years and years, doctors and nurses are having to use plastic bags, bin bags, and snorkels as makeshift personal protective equipment. The NHS is having to buy beds at millions at cost of millions to the public purse from private hospitals because of the shortage of beds. Intensive care units were at over 90% capacity even before the outbreak, so you can imagine what it's like now. And the government has been, by turns, incredibly callous and stupefyingly incompetent. For instance, the UK is presently aiming to stock hospitals with 46,000 ventilators in total. How many new ones do you think it acquired in the first month? It's 30. They acquired 30 new ventilators. They needed 46,000. A newsreader was reading this out on BBC and said the government has acquired 30 ventilators. Even the BBC newscaster was shocked at how appalling the government response has been. And part of the reason for this is that early on, our Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson, was under the advice of the most degenerate and right-wing layer of the Tory party, pushing for a response based around acquiring herd immunity. And herd immunity is basically when you have enough people who've acquired immunity to the virus through exposure that it can't spread and propagate and eventually dies out. The real reason for this is they wanted to keep business going as long as possible without actually enacting a lockdown, social distancing measures. And that was only abandoned after it turned out that this could result in 250,000 avoidable deaths. The government was directly ignoring scientific and medical advice because it was under pressure from the capitalists to keep the British economy going for as long as possible. And when he was asked about this, Boris Johnson went quite openly in the press and told people, your loved ones will die. You have to accept your loved ones will die. So when we talk about people being sacrificed on the altar of profit, we're not being glib as Marxists. The capitalists are telling us this to our faces. But now on to your question. So the US government's cut funding for an Australian research lab that was about to test a vaccine for SARS-1 that might, with minor tweaks, have meant that you'd have a vaccine now that would have the capacity to halt the spread of COVID-19, or at least you'd be much further along. You might shave 12 months off the time it would take to produce a vaccine. By the time that this funding was cut, the government had already invested $1 billion into this vaccine. And 1.5 million was all that was needed to complete the project when it was pulled. It was absolute madness that this wasn't completed. But the problem is that the high cost and high reward, high risk business model of for-profit medical R&D doesn't apply very well to active pandemics because the market immediately dries up as soon as the crisis peters out, which means the funding is pulled and the research is shelved and it just stops until the next pandemic starts. And we've all heard apologists for capitalism preaching the superiority of the free market system. It's innovative, it drives, fresh new ideas, it pushes technology forward and so on. In medical R&D, pharmaceutical R&D, probably one of the most important sectors of science and technology, the science is completely hobbled by market forces. It is kneecapped by market forces. Big Pharma is socializing the risks of drug development and privatizing the profits. The capitalists aren't investing unless they can be guaranteed a windfall. They don't give a damn about public health, and that has a direct impact on the number of new drugs that are being produced. In the last 2 decades, there have been a number of international viral outbreaks that have claimed thousands of lives. I named a few already, SARS, MERS, Zika, Ebola, and so on. And to date, only one vaccine for these diseases has reached the market for Ebola, and even that isn't widely available or cost effective in the markets where it's most needed, countries like Africa, countries in Africa. There are 35 companies right now that are currently testing for a vaccine for COVID-19. And a company called Moderna has made the most progress on developing a candidate drug so far. And it'll take about a year before it clears human trials. But even if it does, it'll require another big pharma company to take on the mass production of a vaccine. And the reason for that is because the biggest such companies like Pfizer, Novartis, and so on have a stranglehold on the bulk of raw materials, and they've consolidated patents on the manufacturing process. And these companies will expect to turn a profit on a vaccine once it's produced. The last time the US government approved a national vaccination program, it was for swine flu back in 1976. And 4 drug firms refused to sell, these are the big pharma companies, refused to sell the governments the 100 million doses that they manufactured until they got full liability indemnity and a guaranteed profit. One of the interesting contradictions at the heart of all this is that the majority of pharmaceutical R&D funding does come from the private sector. It accounted for about 67% of the total amount invested in the US health sector for research in 2018. And the pharmaceutical companies use these high R&D costs to justify boosting prices on existing, older and generic drugs to the point that essential medicines like insulin can cost $25 to $100 a vial in the States. But in spite of all the money coming from the private sector, the vast majority of new medicines are produced by research that's conducted either by the states or in state-subsidized universities and departments, academic institutions, and that includes the candidate vaccine that's being tested now for COVID-19, which is based on the old research for SARS, it's based on research by the Chinese state, based on research by universities here in the UK and in the States. But rather than advancing medical research and innovation, all these big private pharmaceutical companies do is use their financial clout to amass patents on medicines that are developed with public money. They slap their label on it, they soak up all the profits, and the people who actually develop the drugs barely get a nod. The vaccine for hepatitis A was largely developed, for example, by researchers at the Walter Reed Army Institute, but then marketing rights were given to SmithKline Beecham and Merck. And the market for the vaccine now is about $300 million. And the researchers at the Walter Reed Institute got a plaque. They got a plaque with their names on. They didn't see any of that money reinvested into their research. AIDS drugs like AZT, 3TC, and the protease inhibitor Novir, these are some of the drugs that are part of the cocktail that help prevent HIV-positive patients from developing AIDS. They were all developed by publicly funded labs and hospitals, but drugs giants have IP rights on all of these and can sell them and profit from them. And they sell them for extortionate amounts of money in certain markets, particularly in the States. And not only do you have this issue with these big pharma companies hoarding patents, but because manufacturing new medicines presents a really high risk and not enough of assured profits, the drugs companies devote most of their resources towards more lucrative, immediately lucrative avenues, like churning out lifestyle drugs like Viagra, which are relatively easy to make and will always have a market. That rakes in a lot more cash for companies like Pfizer than researching cures and drugs for complex long-term diseases. And these companies also artificially boost the prices of existing drugs. It was estimated by research from the University of Liverpool that an antiviral that was initially devised by Gilead Sciences for Ebola could be useful for treating COVID-19, and it could be mass-produced for $9 per treatment course. Another one is a treatment for hepatitis C, based on the Gilead molecule as well, is currently on sale for $18,610 per treatment course in the US. But the actual cost, which would still produce a profit for the capitalists, should be $5 for a single course of the medicine, or 39 cents a day. This is the extent to which the capitalists are artificially pushing up the market price of their product. All of these practices mean that big pharma is the most profitable, legitimate industry on earth, and it's making more money than ever. But the number of the new drugs coming out of the private sector is in steep decline. research into vaccines for the biggest killer diseases have been basically stagnant since the 1960s. So far from advancing this essential sector, capitalism is quite literally taking us backwards. And I don't just mean that things are stagnant. I mean that these companies are destroying factories or shuttering factories that produce drugs and treatments that they already have because they're not producing enough of a profit. That's especially true for diseases that are most prevalent in poor countries. But I'm sure we'll talk about that more later on.
Okay. You mentioned that in the beginning of the virus outbreak, there weren't any measures taken in Great Britain because they wanted herd immunity, and they also wanted to keep on producing and didn't want to hurt the economy. But did it even make a difference in the end for the economy, or is it even worse right now?
The economy is in an absolutely dire state. It's been predicted that we could face a shrinkage of the economy that's only matched by the Great Depression of the 1930s. The only difference that the government's herd immunity strategy actually had was that thousands of people who wouldn't have died. And that could have an impact on the consciousness of the working class. There's currently a huge amount of controversy in Britain because there are scientists who are offering advice to the government who are now coming forward saying, we warned you this wouldn't work. We warned you that this was a dangerous, reckless, and ultimately ineffective approach that wouldn't do anything positive for the economy and would kill thousands of people. And it's very possible that an inquiry of some kind will result. And once the Tories' deadly hubris is brought to light by this, I think it will enrage thousands of workers and youth across Britain. I think it will result in a huge amount of resentment towards the government because it will be plain as day that the government chose to prioritise profits over human lives. So no, I don't think that there's any evidence that there was any positive impact on the British economy by avoiding social distancing until the last minute. And I think it could have a much more powerful effect on the class struggle than the ruling class was reckoning for.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Nation states protect the interests and monopolies of the big pharma companies. To what extent does this undermine the functioning of international bodies such as the World Health Organization?
Well, first of all, I should say that the World Health Organization has a lot of problems. I mean, it's not a socialist body by any means. It's riven with corruption allegations. It favors the interests of the big imperialists. But nevertheless, viruses know no borders. And we do need a global response, and we need international bodies to respond to pandemics. And the narrow national interests of capitalist countries currently make this impossible. And it's undermining what bodies currently exist to coordinate global responses to public health disasters. Donald Trump had actually cut the funding of the WHO in half even before the pandemic because his America First policies are strongly opposed to any kind of international cooperation. And he's demagogically now been attacking the WHO because it's criticized his response to COVID-19, which up until the last minute was to basically imply it was a hoax or a foreign ploy to undermine American greatness. He's accused the WHO of being an ally of China, and he's trying to direct demagogically anger towards its lead scientists. The point is that the protectionist tendencies that existed in the markets prior to the pandemic were already reflected strongly in the pharma sector, and all these tendencies have now been accelerated. The hollowness of so-called solidarity between EU member states, for instance, has been ruthlessly exposed by this pandemic. European nations throwing up borders, new borders, hoarding their medical supplies. Schengen's been functionally suspended. And when Italy, which was very badly affected early on by COVID-19, had a very high death rate, called on its fellow EU member states to help it in its time of need, all of them turned their backs. And interestingly, there are lots of people in the most badly affected communities in Italy who noticed that the only country that were providing assistance, the only country really providing assistance was China. And obviously, China is an imperialist capitalist country as well, but it's having an interesting social effect where Italians are saying it's only the communists in China that are helping us. The EU isn't helping us. It's really contributing to the class anger and the anti-EU sentiment that was already building in Italy. And the wealthiest nations are already rushing as well to secure exclusivity on a vaccine, with Donald Trump again being first into the dog pile, trying to buy up research by a German biotech firm, I think, because the first country that secures a vaccine and secures exclusivity can first of all use it to treat its own population and therefore get its economy back on track faster, but also can turn a fortune on a potentially life-saving medicine by setting the price for all the other markets of the world. But the nation state is bound up with the other biggest fetter on the development of the productive forces, which is private property. Intellectual property regimes, as I've already touched on, have had a devastating effect on the development of medical science, and they're causing all sorts of problems in terms of responding to COVID-19. For instance, the best way to currently identify candidate drugs for COVID-19 is to use AI to crunch huge quantities of data from all over the world, from research labs all over the world, to find the drugs and the combinations of drugs that might work. But this process is being hampered because the competing pharmaceutical companies in different countries are refusing to share all of their patented research data in this way. And the problem isn't just limited to COVID-19, it's a general one. In 1994, TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, agreed that there'd be a 20-year IP protection on all products by all companies taking part, including pharmaceutical firms, when selling their commodities in World Trade Organization countries. So basically, this enacted really harsh intellectual property regimes. But that was really problematic when it came to pharmaceuticals in poorer countries, because essential drugs were the intellectual property of private companies in the West, whose prices were often too high for these markets, and who resisted very aggressively any attempts by other countries to produce cheaper derivatives of their products. So, for example, after the South African government passed the Medicines Act in 1997 to assure that HIV/AIDS drugs were affordable, and this obviously was at the peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa, the Vice President of the European Commission argued that the Act, and I'm quoting here, would appear to be at variance with South Africa's obligations under the WTO TRIPS, and its implementation would negatively affect the interests of the European pharmaceutical industry. So the US put South Africa on a trade watch list and threatened economic sanctions in response to this, including a bill which went through Congress that made all aid to South Africa contingent on dropping this law. So the big countries, the big imperialist countries, they use their international trade bodies, they use their international political bodies to ensure that poor countries are forced to pay the prices they set for essential resources on which they have intellectual property rights. When it was noticed that this was literally resulted in millions of people dying from preventable diseases, or at least treatable diseases, in 2001, and this was at the initiative of the World Health Organization, the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health was agreed by all member states of the World Trade Organization that said that public health should always take precedence over the enforcement of intellectual property rights. But in reality, this is absolutely not what happened. And in 2019, the charity Oxfam released a report which basically proved what everybody always knew. They said, and I'm quoting again, "Rich countries and pharmaceutical companies have ignored the Doha Declaration and pursued an aggressive agenda to subject the developing world to even stricter IP protection through free trade agreements and unilateral pressure." So basically, wealthy imperialist nations will always crush the weak, and the private property rights of the capitalists will always trump human need, irrespective of what bodies like the WHO, bodies like the WTO say or claim. The power of the strongest nation states will always win out, and the interests of the capitalists they represent. if you had a regime of federated socialist countries, for example, then any new viral outbreak could be met immediately with a concerted global response to prevent it from reaching pandemic levels. And you could divert research and resources and production to all the necessary areas for treatments, for isolation, and all the necessary resources in terms of simple things like face masks, which have been lacking, up to ventilators, which cost like $11,000 on the market at the moment, could be shared, could be produced in higher volumes, could be without borders, sent out to wherever they were most needed and utilized on the basis of need. But as it stands, the capitalists, big pharma companies, dictate to nation states to defend their interests, irrespective of human need. The US alone, in the US alone, drugs companies spend $75 million a year in lobbying to make sure that whatever government sits in the White House, their interests will be served all over the world. There's actually one pharmaceutical lobbyist for every 2 members of Congress. So whenever anyone tells you that capitalism is the most democratic and humane system that could possibly exist, this isn't a democracy. This is a dictatorship of capital, which is literally leaving millions of human beings at the mercy of preventable diseases.
Mm-hmm. Before you mentioned China and the help is coming from China, what about Cuba?
Yeah, that's been fascinating, hasn't it? I've really enjoyed all those YouTube and Facebook videos of Cuban doctors arriving, bearing their flag, looking and being welcomed like heroes in countries like Italy. Well, Cuba's healthcare system, as we know, is the envy not just of the region but of the world. It's a clear testament to the superiority of a planned economy that a tiny Caribbean island that's under a severe regime of sanctions by the most powerful imperialist country in the world has been exporting essential medical assistance to some of the most powerful capitalist countries in Europe. And aside from doctors, it's also been sending huge quantities of drugs like interferon alpha 2B, which was developed in Cuba in 1986 by the state-run BioCuba Pharma company. And it's been tested with positive results on coronavirus patients. But it's actually not just in terms of dealing with coronavirus that Cuban medicine excels. I've mentioned companies like Pfizer. So they've been dropping their research regimes into complicated, life-altering or life-threatening diseases consistently over the last several years. I think in 2017, Pfizer abandoned all research into Alzheimer's disease, for instance, because they weren't making progress. If they aren't making progress, it means they're not making money. Whereas in Cuba, there have been exciting breakthroughs in terms of treatments for Alzheimer's and treatments for HIV. I mean, neither of those things are cured as it stands. However, Cuba hasn't been abandoning its research because it's not been netting immediate profits in the way that private pharmaceutical companies have. But in terms of dealing with COVID-19, I read a really interesting academic paper about how Cuba has many advantages over capitalist countries when it comes to dealing with the public health crisis. So because Cuba's got a centrally planned and state-controlled economy, it means the government can mobilize resources quickly and efficiently. And its national emergency planning structure is connected with local organizations in every corner of the country. So there's a very quick link up between the national and the local response to disasters like this. A prevention and control plan was prepared in January this year, included training medical staff, preparing medical and quarantine facilities, informing the public, including tourism workers, about symptoms and precautions for dealing with COVID-19. So when the first 3 reported cases were confirmed, 2 months later, in March, arrangements already in place to trace and isolate people who were suspected of being infected, to mobilize medical students for nationwide door-to-door surveys to identify vulnerable people and check for symptoms, and to roll out a nationwide testing program. The government also announced a ban on tourist arrivals, lockdown for vulnerable people, for older people, for people with pre-existing conditions. It made provisions for home working. It reassigned workers for priority tasks. So unlike in Britain, for instance, where many people have been furloughed, so at best they're on 80% of their wages, and many more in the gig economy and the informal sector have just been sacked and have lost their income altogether and have to sit in a queue waiting for state benefits, Cuba just redirected people to other professions because they have a planned economy. And as issues arose, the Cuban government was able to adjust its response. So when face masks and physical distancing proved insufficient to keep public transport safe, services were suspended, and state and private vehicles and drivers were hired to transport patients and essential workers instead. And to reduce crowding in shops, the distribution system was reorganized and they introduced online shopping through the states. But in spite of all of this, and in spite of all of these advantages, and in spite of all of these, really very good measures that have been taken, Cuba is still only in the middle of Latin American and Caribbean countries in terms of the infection rates. And the main reason for that is because the US has tightened sanctions on the country, which has sharply cut earnings from tourism and other services and deterred foreign investment and hampered trade, and obstructed access to international finance, including emergency funds, which has impacted Cuba's infrastructure. It's impacted its health service. And more recently, the US has launched attacks on Cuba's medical aid missions, with Donald Trump pressing countries to reject them during the coronavirus pandemic and threatening American trade partners that there'll be consequences if they take any drugs or take any doctors or equipment from Cuba. The US embassy in Havana falsely accused the Cuban government of withholding, I'm quoting here, withholding most of the salary of doctors and nurses in international aid missions, exposing them to terrible working conditions. Now, this is absolutely stunning hypocrisy, given the number of doctors and nurses in the States who have died in prime working age due to a lack of proper protection. And that's true in other capitalist countries as well, like my own. There was one 24-hour period where I think 4 or 5 working age nurses died as a consequence of contact with COVID-19 patients and a lack of PPE, not to mention patients dying in the States in prime working age, again, with no underlying conditions because they don't have health insurance. So it is stupefyingly galling that the US can dare to falsely accuse Cuba of withholding payment from doctors and nurses and mistreating them, given the way that these capitalist countries treat their own health staff. And pressure from the US led some governments, some right-wing governments like that of Brazil, to reject aid from Cuba, although amusingly Bolsonaro had to do a 180-degree U-turn about a month later and eventually take resources from Cuba when the situation became more desperate in Brazil. But I think what's been achieved in Cuba is a glimpse of what could be achieved under a planned economy in the advanced capitalist countries. You could see how production could be redirected. You see how measures could be carried out with no detriment to workers. You see how a properly funded and equipped health service can not only be of benefit to the people of that country, but also to people throughout the world. For all the limitations imposed by imperialism, I think that what Cuba's achieved really demonstrates the superiority of a planned economy over a capitalist one.
Okay. In what way are poor countries further disadvantaged by the way the pharma multinationals function?
Well, I think the barbarism of capitalism is most evident in the public health situation faced by the poorest countries in the world. It's really here that the ugly face of capitalism is laid bare. Currently, less than 10% of global health research public spending is dedicated to the diseases that affect the 90% poorest in the world's population. And if there's little interest from private drug companies in risking their capital to research drugs and vaccines for dangerous diseases in the West, there's absolutely none at all for them to research diseases that affect people in the poorest parts of the world. Harvey Bale Jr., who's the head of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, asserted that there is no marketplace to speak of in the poor world. And that's basically the attitude of Big Pharma when it comes to the poorest countries. Between 1975 and 1997, multinational pharmaceutical companies bought 1,230 3 new medications to the market, and only 1% of these, so that's 13 medications, were specifically designed to treat tropical diseases plaguing the third world, which kill millions of people every single year. In the late 90s, a real clear demonstration of the madness and cruelty of capitalism on a global scale was demonstrated, and also the mismatch between the productive potential in society and the limits imposed by capitalism, because the genome for tuberculosis had been sequenced, and TB causes terrible suffering in the poorest parts of the world. It's not particularly prevalent in the richest parts of the world, but it still kills millions in the poorest parts. So the WHO organized a 1998 summit to gain support from leading pharmaceutical companies to develop a vaccine and treatments. They were looking back to the elimination of polio, the elimination of smallpox, and they thought that given that they now had the science to combat TB, they could do the same. But none of these companies was willing to commit to a project that would realistically yield a profits of less than $350 million a year for 5 years or more. To put that in perspective, that would have required a total cost of $11 per pill per patient in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, which at the time spent less than $10 per citizen per year on all healthcare needs. So in short, the capitalists were demanding that the poorest countries in the world achieve the impossible. And if they couldn't, then they refused to invest, and the project was abandoned. Science literally provided a way to potentially eradicate one of humanity's oldest enemies, one of the worst killer diseases in our history, and capitalism made it impossible. Not the science, not the technology, the economic system. So international bodies like the WHO and the G8 have attempted to incentivize private sector investment in the poor world, but Big Pharma either doesn't think these incentives are good enough, or they find ways to game the system, making millions by registering old products in new territories without contributing a single new drug to the medical arsenal of developing countries. And some poorer countries have tried to offset rising drug costs by investing in their own pharmaceutical manufacture and distribution channels at the cost of deepening their foreign debt. But the bosses organization, like the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, have argued this represents an infringement on their free market rights and successfully lobbied for really stringent IP regimes in the poorest parts of the world, again, in defiance of the Doha Declaration. Giaxo Wellcome, which is a private pharma company, has recently threatened legal action against I say recently, I think this was actually a few years ago, but it threatened legal action against the Indian generics company Kipla for trying to provide Ghana and Uganda with cheap versions of Combivir, which is an HIV treatment. This is a pill that combines 2 drugs that were developed in the US with public funding. And the Indian lab trying to produce a cheaper version, and the bosses organization basically prevented that and left poor sufferers of HIV in Ghana and Uganda to their fate. The only value that private pharma really sees in the developing world is as a testing lab to outsource its clinical trials, which is the single biggest cost of drug development. And this cost is significantly offset by exploiting subjects in places like India and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where not only are people, there are more desperate and poor people who are willing to risk their health in these trials, but also you don't really have any regulation, so you can get around all that bothersome red tape. And this was exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, when 2 French doctors caused outrage with racist comments suggesting that trials on African populations to see if a tuberculosis vaccine could prove effective against coronavirus was a sensible course of action. This really was the mask slipping. These doctors regarded Africans as their lab rats, and imperialism really does regard the people living in the poorest parts of the world as the lab rats of imperialism. So they won't provide the medicine, but they will test new medicines for the West on them. And this has had a really detrimental impact on many hundreds of people. For instance, there was a scandal in the late 90s and early noughties when there was a meningitis epidemic in Nigeria that affected more than 150,000 people, and about 15,000 people had died by the time it ended. And Pfizer set up a team called the Pfizer Meningitis Study to carry out medical trials on a drug called Trovin. And it was tested on hundreds of children, all of whom, or many of whom, got terrible side effects, some of whom died. And throughout all of this, Pfizer did not seek consent from either the children or the parents in the trial. And when this was pointed out, Pfizer replied that that was because many of these people didn't speak English and couldn't read or write, and therefore couldn't provide written consent, which first of all was a lie. Many of the people who took part in the trial, their parents could read and write and could speak English, but nevertheless, it's a pretty disgusting attitude to have, that you can freely test any new drug you like on children in a poor country, and the reason you don't have to seek their consent is because they can't speak your language. It really shows the condescending and the inhuman attitude the capitalists have to these people. And disease, of course, helps to keep the poor world poor. When HIV/AIDS ravaged the African continent in the late 80s up to the 90s and to this present day, it killed tens of millions of people, but it also wiped double digits off the state budget to countries like Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda, and so on. And imperialism has been directly responsible for public health disasters in the developing world. For example, and this is an example that perhaps will be especially relevant to people in this school, after the assassination of the priest Patrice Lumumba in the Congo at the behest of Belgian and US imperialism, the country's health infrastructure was crippled under the new regime, the corrupt totalitarian regime of Mobutu Sese Seko, who looted the state coffers in order to enrich himself and his officials, which laid the basis for a terrible Ebola outbreak in the 1990s. Because there were no doctors, there wasn't sufficient medical equipment, people were having to try and sterilize medical equipment over Bunsen burners in dirty water because of all the damage that had been caused to the economy and to the health service. And insulting attempts from the 1970s onwards by the World Bank to pressurize poor countries to spend more on disease prevention and healthcare have been curtailed by the fact they need to service huge debts to bodies like the IMF. The US and Europe have forced third world countries over the course of successive decades to open up their markets and privatize their public services, including health and education. And it's in these conditions that diseases like HIV/AIDS have been able to spread faster in these countries than anywhere else in the world. And because of the dire state of the health service in these countries and because of the lack of affordable medicine, HIV can be a death sentence, whereas in countries like Britain, countries like Belgium, countries like America, you can survive on HIV for many years. At the moment, with regards to the current pandemic, the poorest countries have a relatively low rate of infection, and that's partly due to a young population, which isn't a good thing. That's because of a low life expectancy and a high birth rate. But it's mostly due to a lack of international travel. However, there have been cases breaking out in Nigeria, in Pakistan, in Somalia, and so on. And what's going to happen if and when the virus really takes hold in countries like this, countries that in some instances have a barely functional state apparatus, given the stranglehold effect of imperialism for decades and decades? The lack of sanitation and decent housing in these countries makes social distancing and constant hand washing and all of the nice advice that we get from our governments here in the West impossible. And there is no health infrastructure. You sometimes have one doctor per 10,000 people. You have one bed per 20,000 people. If the virus takes hold in these countries, it'll take a side to the populations. It will be a living nightmare. And this is a nightmare of the system's making, which is why I say in the developing world, the fight against COVID-19 is also a fight against imperialism, because imperialism is the reason that these countries are so vulnerable to public health epidemics, which, by the way, were provoked by capitalism for the reasons I've described. And it's also the reason that they don't have access to the resources to treat and cope with the pandemics once they break out. So fighting against COVID-19 and fighting against capitalist imperialism in these poorest countries are one and the same, in my opinion.
Okay. Then in your article, you talk about the threat of many more pandemics. You mentioned it at the start of this interview as well. Also, it says that disease ecologist Thomas Gillespie says the majority of pathogens are still to be discovered. We are at the very tip of the iceberg. We seem to have entered a period in which many more pandemics could develop in a short period of time because of this ecological destruction, mass livestock farming, and health systems that were destroyed due to austerity measures. What is our perspective to get out of this? Is there a way we could avoid such a scenario?
Well, the author, the journalist I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, Laurie Garrett, she responded to this report by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board in 2018 by basically saying, look, it's all very nice, the things you're proposing. This is all very positive. These are nice words, but frankly, they've all been said before for decades, and I don't see anything changing. And I think that on the basis of capitalism, that's true. I don't think anything will change. I think things are going to get worse, as a matter of fact. But there's an excellent quote from the epidemiologist Larry Brilliant, which is actually his name, Larry Brilliant, who led the fight against smallpox. He said that outbreaks are inevitable, but pandemics are optional. Now, he didn't mean what I'm about to say, I don't think, but I do believe that his sentiment holds. None of this has to happen. None of this has to happen. All of this comes from the insanity of anarchic, free market, for-profit production, private property, and national antagonisms. These are the reasons, the concrete reasons, that pandemics are more likely. It's the reason that we're less equipped to deal with them. And it's the reason that once they do break out, rather than everybody actually banding together and really pitching in to protect the vulnerable and to prevent the virus from spreading rampantly, you have nation states competing with one another and erecting new barriers to dealing with the problem. Whereas if you had a planned economy, all the productive and scientific potential of humanity could be harnessed, and it could be directed towards developing vaccines for the biggest killer diseases. You would never have a vaccine that had $1 billion invested and then with like 1% more budgets having a working vaccine simply being shelved because there was no more market. You would see all those research projects through, and you'd have a massively increased arsenal of vaccines to deal with the world's biggest killer diseases. And then you could carry out a global mass immunization program. So you could eradicate diseases like Ebola, for instance, in the same way that we eradicated diseases like smallpox and diseases like polio. And the environmental destruction and intensive farming techniques that create breeding grounds for pathogens be replaced with production that was planned in harmony with nature, that prioritized human and animal welfare over profits, and that didn't result in food production that caused a huge long-term risk to public health. The parasitic profiteering big pharma operations that are currently making us deal with situations like COVID-19 without the tools to fight it could be expropriated, and their immense operations managed on a democratic basis to produce vaccines and antigens as needed. And if you did have outbreaks, then production could be diverted towards essential medical resources to manage the economy. You wouldn't have to go cap in hand to the private sector for ventilators, for beds, for face masks, and so on. And non-essential production could be halted and social distancing measures carried out whenever necessary without any impact on pay. And in terms of the last 2 points, we've seen a glimpse of that in the response by Cuba. It's demonstrated that on a small scale that's possible. There's no reason on the basis of a planned economy that a large, powerful, developed capitalist country couldn't do the same thing if its economy was a socialist one. And logistics could be planned to ensure that stocks of supermarkets were filled, the basic necessities were distributed, and nobody felt the need to hoard essentials and fight over toilet paper and so on, as we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. And rather than antagonize capitalist nations rushing to hoard resources and trying to figure out how they can make huge profits for their capitalists off the back of new vaccines, federated socialist countries could present a genuine united front against epidemics. And rather than being crushed under the imperialist jackboot, the developing world could be raised out of the nightmarish situation it faces now with massive investment in healthcare, infrastructure, housing and sanitation, so that you don't have a situation where millions of people have precisely no protection against dangerous diseases like COVID-19. The problem is nothing to do with the science, it's nothing to do with technology. The problem is that the capitalists who currently privately own the means of production will only invest for short-term returns. But medical R&D doesn't really produce short-term returns. It produces, resources take a long time to develop. It occurs over the course of years, but we need that kind of long-term investment and that long-term planning for the future, given that we're going to face more pandemics. The problem is you can't plan what you don't own. So for the sake of public health, we need to expropriate and democratically manage the productive forces to protect millions of people in the future. And there's nothing positive about the situation, of course. I mean, there's nothing positive about thousands of people being taken before their time. However, there has been an awakening to political life for millions of people as a result of this pandemic, because millions of people are now seeing stark evidence that the system doesn't really care about them, that the capitalists see their lives as small change, that they're willing to sacrifice their health in order to protect their profits. And we've seen the working class beginning to fight back. You know, there have been waves of strikes already in Italy, in Spain, in Canada, in the USA, to try and force the bosses to halt production where it's not necessary, to provide proper protective equipment and safety measures and so on. And this is a harbinger of the period to come. The pandemic is preparing radical political class struggle in the future. And I do believe the working class will have a reckoning with the powers that be that have chosen to protect profits over their health. And in my view, we need to build a socialist alternative. We need to win people to the INC to prepare an organization that can lead the working class to overthrow this disease system. Because I do believe that there will be nothing will get better in terms of our responses to global pandemics in the next period unless we have a reckoning with the system that ultimately is to blame.
Okay, let's hope so.
Thank you, Martin, for the intervention. If anybody else has any questions or remarks, you can leave them in the chat. You can also leave them on Facebook. Our Facebook page is Marxistische Jongeren Vonk. And if you do have questions later today, you can post them in the comments and we will try to answer them as separate Facebook posts the coming days. And if there's nothing else, then I would propose to end the meeting here. Once again, Joe, thank you for being here. Thank you for talking to us. And then everybody else can keep up to date with our events on Facebook and our other live streams we will hold in the coming weeks and the coming days. So thank you all very much. And I hope I'll see you soon. And stay safe. Bye-bye.